The room was silent except for the scratching of a quill. Not a courtroom, not a council chamber. Just a dim workshop in Lisbon, where one man drew a line that could split continents in half. That man was Pedro Reinel, and the line wasn't innocent. It would trigger a diplomatic storm between Spain and Portugal, two empires, armed to the teeth and hunting the same prize, the rest of the planet. Reinel knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't expect the world to bleed for it. The story starts with the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. A single vertical line across the Atlantic dividing new worlds between the rival crowns. Spain gets west, Portugal gets east. Simple on paper, impossible in reality. Because no one actually knew where that line fell once ships left Europe. Distances were estimates. Oceans were rumors, and maps? They were weapons disguised as parchment. Portugal understood this better than anyone. They ran cartography like an intelligence agency. Every coastline sketch, every wind pattern, every reef locked away as state secrets. Captains swore oaths, navigators worked under surveillance. Even mistakes were classified. And sitting in the middle of all this paranoia was Reinel, Portugal's most skilled mapmaker, trusted with the crown's most sensitive visuals. He had talent, precision, and something far more valuable, loyalty to his king. So when the Portuguese court needed a map that tilted the world a bit in their favor, they didn't send soldiers. They sent a quiet man with ink-stained fingers. The pressure on him was real. Portugal was desperate. Spain had just funded Columbus, and their explorers were bragging about entire continents lying in their half of the world. If Spain could prove the new lands were west of the treaty line, Portugal was finished. Reinel was told to clarify the boundary. That word carried weight. It didn't mean accuracy. It meant advantage. He adjusted the meridian, just a nudge, subtle enough to pass as expertise. A shift of a few degrees. A distortion so small most navigators wouldn't notice. But on a global map, that tweak handed Portugal control of strategic waters thousands of miles away. He wasn't forging a document. He was forging reality. From Lisbon's perspective, it wasn't cheating. It was survival. Spain, of course, didn't know any of this. During negotiations, they accepted Portuguese charts, assuming both sides were dealing in good faith, because who lies about the shape of the ocean? A foolish assumption. With Reinel's new map, Portugal suddenly claimed territories that hadn't belonged to them yesterday. And not tiny islands, the kind of regions that determine trade routes, profits, and dominance. Spanish envoys stared at the map and sensed something was off. Coastlines they'd seen in person didn't match these drawings. Distances felt manipulated. But they had no proof. Reinel's reputation gave the map credibility. Portugal's confidence sold the illusion. Spain signed documents based on these charts. And the fuse was lit. When Spanish ships later sailed toward areas they believed were theirs, they ran into Portuguese patrols claiming treaty violation. Portugal insisted the Spanish were trespassing. Spain insisted the Portuguese were lying. Every captain at sea was suddenly navigating not by stars, but by politics. Every disagreement on the water escalated. Shouting turned to seized cargo. Seized cargo turned to cannon fire. The line on Reinel's map had become a battlefield. At court, Spanish diplomats demanded explanations. Why did Portuguese charts differ from the logs of Spanish navigators? Why did the boundary move? Why did the world suddenly bend eastward? Portugal shrugged it off with royal arrogance. Your navigators must be mistaken. Our cartographers are the experts. The map is correct. Your claims are not. Reinel said nothing. He couldn't. Admitting the truth meant admitting he'd tampered with the geopolitical balance of the planet. But his silence didn't stop the spiral. If this already sounds tense, you'll want to hear what happens when Spain uncovers the first cracks in Reinel's deception. By now, Both empires were convinced the other was cheating. And when superpowers believe they're being robbed, they don't negotiate, they prepare for war. This was no longer a disagreement over geography. It was a contest over who controlled the future. Reinel watched it unfold from the shadows, realizing that the tiny shift he inked into his map had grown into a monster that neither crown could tame. The first cracks appeared far from any palace on the deck of a Spanish carrack drifting along the South Atlantic. Captain Morales unfurled Reinel's chart, compared it to the coastline in front of him, and swore loud enough for his crew to pretend they didn't hear. The map said he was in Spanish waters. The Portuguese cannons aimed at him said otherwise. Morales barely escaped. His report, once it reached Spain, detonated through the Royal Council like gunpowder. Suddenly, the doubts weren't whispers. They were accusations. Spain suspected fraud. Portugal denied everything. And Pedro Reinel, comfortably hidden inside Lisbon, kept drawing maps that didn't match reality. The rivalry escalated fast. Portuguese patrols doubled along their claimed routes. Spanish captains traveled armed and angry. Smaller clashes turned into full naval standoffs. Two ships circling each other, guns primed, each captain waving the treaty like scripture. But the treaty didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was asterisk, whose map you believed asterisk. And right now, everyone believed different maps. Reinel's subtle shift had turned the ocean into a courtroom without rules. Spain's investigators dug deeper and found something damning. Columbus logs, Cabral's routes, independent pilots' journals, none of them matched Reinel's latitudes. Not even close. Spain brought this evidence to Portugal, demanding a correction. Portugal laughed it off. Your pilots are incompetent. It's your data that's flawed. Our maps are precise. The diplomatic temperature hit boiling point. Every meeting ended in shouting. Every envoy left convinced they were dealing with liars. And both sides were right. Reinel tried to stay out of the political brawl, but he couldn't avoid the consequences. Not when his maps were being weaponized in every argument, every naval chase, every territorial claim. His workshop became a pressure chamber. Officials visited more frequently. Some politely, some not. Each one asking the same question without daring to say it out loud. Can you push the line just a little more? Reinel resisted. A little. But the crown's demands were relentless, and he knew refusing meant losing everything. Cartographers served at the pleasure of the king. Displeasure meant exile, disgrace, or vanishing at sea. So he adjusted again. A degree here. A recalibrated latitude there. Each tiny manipulation ripple-affected across thousands of miles. His maps kept Portugal strong. They also kept the conflict alive. Out on the water, things got worse. A Spanish fleet approached an island chain they believed fell solidly in their sphere. The Portuguese governor stationed there had a different interpretation, an interpretation drawn directly from Reinel's doctored map. The meeting didn't end with conversation. It ended with warning shots. Ships damaged, crews wounded, diplomats humiliated. Both crowns claimed the other had initiated aggression. Both blamed faulty cartography, although faulty wasn't the real issue. Someone had lied, and both sides were finally ready to admit it. Then came the moment that snapped the last thread of trust. Spain acquired a secret copy of an earlier Reinel chart-created asterisk before asterisk Portugal started leaning on him. It didn't match the new one. Not even remotely. Two maps, same cartographer. Two completely different world boundaries. The Spanish Council erupted. Some demanded war. Others demanded public exposure. All agreed on one thing. Portugal had cheated the treaty. And behind that cheat stood one man with ink-stained hands. Reinel felt the walls closing in. The court praised him in public, but interrogated him in private. Spain cursed him in public and hunted for more proof in secret. He realized he wasn't just drawing coastlines anymore. He was drawing front lines. Still, he kept working. Because stopping meant consequences he didn't want to imagine. Portugal needed him. Or rather, Portugal needed his ability to distort reality without seeming to. But even the best illusions crack eventually. And the crack finally arrived not through diplomacy, but through sailors. Dozens of navigators from different nations started comparing notes. Distances didn't add up. Coasts shifted when they shouldn't. The world seemed to bend strangely on Portuguese charts, but nowhere else. The suspicion crystallized into a single damning question. What if the map is lying? By now, the conflict was impossible to contain. Every voyage risked becoming an international incident. Every misunderstanding threatened escalation. Both kingdoms armed more ships. Both funded more expeditions. Both prepared for a confrontation neither admitted they were planning. If this shocked you, wait for the moment Spain uncovers the exact manipulation that tied the world into knots. Because once they did, the fallout didn't just expose a lie. It exposed the mapmaker behind it. The discovery came from a man no one expected to matter, a junior navigator from Andalusia, who cross-checked Portuguese charts with raw celestial readings. He wasn't a diplomat, wasn't a commander, just a sailor who actually knew how to measure the sky. And what he found was brutal. Reinel's latitude lines weren't simply adjusted, they were engineered. Shifted systematically eastward to drag entire regions into Portugal's jurisdiction. Not guesses, not mistakes. A pattern repeated, deliberate, undeniable. Spain finally had the smoking gun. They marched the evidence straight into a diplomatic session in Lisbon and dropped it on the table. No preamble, no courtesy. Just hard math, side-by-side charts, and a blunt accusation that stripped away the last thin layer of politeness between the empires. Portugal froze. For the first time, they didn't have a counter-argument ready. Because this wasn't opinion versus opinion. This was science versus deception. Reinel's deception. The Portuguese council panicked behind closed doors. They knew the implications. If Spain publicized this, Portugal would look like a treaty breaker on a global scale. Their legitimacy, already fragile, would crack. Their rivals would circle like sharks. So they did what desperate governments do when the truth becomes dangerous. They tried to bury the man who created it. Reinel was summoned. Not to be praised, not to be defended, to be interrogated. The workshop where he'd once drawn maps with pride now felt like a trap. Officials pressed him for explanations. Why the shift? Why the distortion? Why jeopardize peace? He couldn't answer without admitting the truth. He did it at the Crown's request. And the Crown had no intention of letting that be said out loud. So he stayed silent. The same silence that once protected him now tightened around his throat like a noose. Meanwhile, Spain escalated. They sent ships to disputed zones and demanded Portuguese withdrawal. Portugal refused, claiming existing cartography supported their right to remain. Spain's reply was simple. We're done believing your cartography. Standoffs turned into captures. Captures into skirmishes. A small naval clash off the coast of Brazil finally delivered the breaking point Spanish vessels fired warning shots. Portuguese captains fired real ones. There was no misunderstanding anymore. The war sparked by a map had officially begun. Reinel watched the chaos unfold, knowing exactly who started it, because he'd drawn the first spark stroke by stroke. He tried to convince himself the guilt wasn't his, that the kingdoms would have fought anyway, that the treaty was flawed from the start, that both sides were greedy. All true, but none of it erased the fact that he'd handed Portugal the weapon. A line on paper with the power to move fleets. A distortion small enough to miss, large enough to ignite conflict. The man who never set foot on a battlefield had become responsible for one. The fallout grew fast. Spain gathered allies to pressure Portugal. Portugal fortified its Atlantic routes. Every sailor in both empires now navigated with suspicion, checking the horizon not for storms, but for foreign flags. And everywhere they looked, one truth kept resurfacing. The world didn't match the Portuguese map. A lie that had once served as leverage now served as evidence. Reinel's work was collapsing under its own contradictions. Then came the final twist, a twist both crowns wished they could erase from the record. Independent cartographers from Italy, France, and the Low Countries conducted their own surveys. Their charts matched reality. They matched Spanish claims. They contradicted Reinel with ruthless precision. Portugal's credibility cracked. Spain demanded full admission. And Reinel, under pressure from every direction, finally broke. Not publicly, not officially, but in a closed council interrogation, he confessed the truth. Yes, I altered the lines. 6 words that rewired the entire geopolitical map. The lie was exposed. The war was already underway, and both kingdoms understood the same ugly fact. One mapmaker had redrawn the world for reasons far smaller than the consequences. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was colder than that. Portugal quietly removed Reinel from sensitive work. The crown distanced itself. Spain celebrated diplomatically while escalating militarily. Territories were seized, lost, reclaimed, always with the treaty held up like a shield. But the damage was permanent. From that point on, neither empire trusted the other's charts. Every future negotiation demanded verification, third-party measurements, and international oversight. Because once a single lie moves a boundary, every boundary becomes suspect. That's how Pedro Reinel, unknown to most, invisible to battlefields, ended up shaping the global balance of power more than admirals or kings. He didn't fire a cannon. He just bent a line. And the world tore itself around it. If you want more stories where small choices trigger massive consequences, you know what to do.